this is an image of Nova Scotia. And the pink dots are proposed protected areas that the government is proposing to buy or to develop in some way. And the green is the existing protected areas of Nova Scotia. Not a lot. Not a lot there. Our government announced an ambitious plan in 2013 to protect 245,000 hectares of forest and parkland, establishing ourselves as one of the top provinces for conservation as a leader. They're hoping that 14% of all land in Nova Scotia will be legally protected from development. It will end up, I think, that Nova Scotia may have the second highest percentage of land devoted to protected areas in Canada after British Columbia. This is another example of the block. And they kind of clump it because it's very difficult to have protected lands if it's not in big chunks. Because big chunks are required for biodiversity and for animals who need wilderness to survive. This is a picture of Aylesford Lake, where I come from, down the valley. Sort of in the center, there's this big island that's kind of long, and that's Camp Brigadoon. I don't know if you've heard of either Camp Brigadoon Village. It's got a swath of light color there. And it's pretty developed across the lake. On this side of the lake, all of this land around us, sort of the lake that's in the lower left-hand corner, has just recently been purchased by the government and made into protected land, which we celebrate. Scott and I, a few years ago, were out on the lake with my father, who also owns on this lake. And we came across a piece of land. And we found out that it was for sale. And we purchased it along with a couple other couples. And that land is actually that big, long island that you see there. And we own the southern tip of it, where all those little dotted islands are. And there are times when I feel a bit like a hypocrite, having purchased a land near a protected land status location, and then subdividing it in order to afford to pay for it. But this land to us is beautiful and pristine, and it makes us feel like we're out in the woods. Yesterday we spent, if you see me doing this, I'm sore, because we were taking down camp after the summer, and the wind was blowing so hard, our tents were flying away like parachutes. But we also needed to walk the perimeter. And as I'm clipping along this trail, my daughter says to me, "Mom, a few weeks ago, we were praying for those trees that you're clipping. That we're not supposed to clip them, we're supposed to plant them." And I said to her, "I know." And I'm near tears as I'm trying to manage this land that we own and not feel too hypocritical. My son Ethan is here today. I hope it's okay I talk about you a little bit. No, asking permission with everybody watching is not a good thing. But he actually knew I was going to talk a bit about this. Actually, he's the one who encouraged me to insert that slide to speak about the truth of my angst, or the truth of my feelings about being a hypocrite. He said it means more to be honest with people about what you struggle with your impact on the climate, than it does to hold it in all. He also said, you should talk about your carbon footprint, because you've hired me, a person who lives in Kentville, to drive back and forth 3 times a week, maybe 4, to provide you with service. And it's hard on me emotionally to feel a little bit hypocritical standing up here for 4 weeks talking about environmental issues and still use all of that gas. I think it speaks to all of us when we throw out that container that could have been rinsed and put in the recycle, or when we drive 5 blocks when we might have been able to walk or bike. And Ethan made me feel a bit better. He said, Mom, it's the little things that you do often that makes a big difference personally. He said, really, I think where we can make a big impact is when we advocate for industry for better standards, or large swaths of land to be developed, large communal efforts. Doesn't make it any easier for my conscience, but it does, in this venue, give us an opportunity as Christians to work towards those kind of things. So thank you to those of you who signed that petition at the back. Now back to this picture. Ethan is reading this book. He got it from his aunt this summer, and it's a book about Christopher McCandless. That's also a picture of the movie. Has anybody seen it? Anybody else? Yes. Okay, that's a bit generational. I don't mean that you guys are like 30s. Yeah. It's really cute, so that might also be why you girls watched it. This was a biological drama. It was made by Sean Penn, and it was adapted from this 1996 book by John Croker, the same guy who wrote Into Thin Air. I don't know if any of you read that, one of my favorite books of all times. Yes. Great. Okay, so different generations. Christopher arrives in a remote national park, just north of a national park in Alaska, and sets up a campsite in an abandoned bus. At first, he's really content with the isolation and the beauty of nature around him, and the thrill of what it takes to live off the land. He hunts for wild animals with his .22, reads books, keeps a diary, and he prepares himself for this new life in the wild. This is a guy who graduates with high honors from Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. He decided one day to destroy all of his credit cards and his identification documents. He takes his only savings, I think it's $24,000, and gives it to Oxfam, and then just sets out across the country hitchhiking. He doesn't tell his parents a thing about what he's doing, and they discover later, after he's long gone, and can't find him, and are frantic about his whereabouts. 4 months later, at the abandoned bus, life becomes harder for him. His supplies begin to run low, and he realizes that nature is pretty harsh. And in the pain of that realization, he journals that he concludes that true happiness can only be found when shared with others, and seeks to return from the wild to his friends and his family. But unfortunately, the stream that he crossed on his way there becomes torrential, wide and deep and violent because of the spring thaw, and he's unable to cross. Saddened, he returns back to his bus and becomes a prisoner, no longer in control of his fate. And he's forced to eat roots and plants. But unfortunately, he confuses some of these plants and eats a poisonous one, and as a result falls sick, and is now too weak to make it back. Slowly dying, it writes, my review of this, he continues to document his process of self-realization and accepts his fate as he imagines his family for one last time. He writes a farewell to the world and crawls into a sleeping bag to die. And 2 weeks later, his body is found by moose hunters. Pretty sad story. I just feel tremendous sorrow for that family and what they had to go through, and for Christopher. A pretty tough book to read for a 16-year-old. During our resources, we're talking about wilderness and outback, and the resources asked me to think about places and times in my own life in which I encountered outback and wilderness. And immediately, what came to me was the rhododendron forest in the Himalayas. Way back, after university, my husband and I saved money tree planting and took a flight out to Thailand, and then we took another flight to Nepal, into Kathmandu. We traveled by bus to Pokhara, and we decided to hike the Annapurna Range. We hired a Sherpa, and we didn't know how far we'd get, but we rented big old parkas and down sleeping bags, and we rented backpacks, and we trusted this guy, and off we went into the woods, through paths, looking down over mountainsides. It's amazing. We all of a sudden come across this little settlement of maybe 5 or 6 houses, and they'd open their doors, and they'd feed us dal, and sometimes Coke, or if we're lucky, they had somebody hike in bottled water that we could drink, and we'd stay there for the night, and we'd get up the next morning, and we'd hike to the next house that we could find, all heading up to Annapurna Base Camp. One day, most of the area is devoid of trees. We came around this bend, and there was this huge forest. And I was looking up at the trees, saying, "What kind of trees are those?" And the Sherpa said, rhododendron? And he said, "Just, they were as big as oak trees. They were massive. They were beautiful. I've never seen anything like it in my life." So we hiked through this forest, and all of a sudden, I could smell this amazing smell, and I looked off next to this stream, and there in front of me was this huge tree, a jasmine tree, in full bloom with full jasmine flowers. The scent was gorgeous, and the biodiversity in that space was so different than the mountainous location in which we were traveling before we hit into that. We got halfway through, and all of a sudden, the branches started waving high above us, and there were squeaks, squeals, and screams. I reached over, I held Scott's hand, I said, "What is that?" And the Sherpa said, "Oh, no worries, it's just the monkeys." They were everywhere in all the branches, and all I could imagine was them coming down and running after us. And it was scary. They were everywhere, these wild monkeys jumping around in these trees. We ended up in a small place called Gorepani. And we were up high. Gorepani is about 2,860 meters above sea level. And we were starting to feel the effects of the thin air. And we weren't sleeping very well, and we were highly anxious, and we had to take lots of time to rest and breathe to get our oxygen levels up. And that night, in that place, in a little stall that I could pretty much reach across, in this little bed that Scott and I were in, shivering, Scott, I'd just fallen asleep, and Scott hits me. He says, wake up, light. Light. And I'm like, what? I need light. And so I had to get my matches and light a candle, and I'm there with him, and he's like breathing into this light as he's experiencing mountain elevation sickness. And we were this close, having to wake our Sherpa up to continue to go down. We still had a long way to go to get to the base camp for Annapurna, but he was already experiencing the altitude issues. At the same time, I was experiencing severe dysentery. So we were in the wild, and I was happy when we were with trees, so that I could send the boys ahead and hope that no other trekkers would come up behind us. And toilet paper became a very important thing in my backpack as we left each guest house as we went on our trip. When we got here, I was quite ill. But we decided that next morning, after Scott's altitude sickness, to try to hike up to Coon Hill, which was about 3,200 meters above sea level. It took about an hour and a half, and we did it in the dark, so that we were able to be there when the sun rose and hit the range. And it was glorious. The mountains changed from sort of a mauve and orange and a pink and reds. The colors were fabulous. It was well worth it. But we were also there with a fairly large crowd of Asian tourists who were taking frantic pictures of this click, 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 click. To make a long story short, I could not wait for them to leave so that I could use the bush where they could have potentially taken a picture of me, and it would have been up on the web forever. And as I'm sitting there wringing my hands, worrying about my health and thinking about it, Scott comes up and puts his arms around me, and he rocks me back and forth, and he starts speaking, and all of a sudden I realize what he's saying has turned to rhyme. And he says, and then he stops, he says, what are you thinking about now, Krista? And I'm thinking about the children of Nepal. And he didn't let me finish. I was thinking of how miserable their lives were if they're experiencing dysentery in this poverty-stricken country. Because this is what I'm going through. But he didn't let me finish. And then he went back into rhyme and he said, because it would cause me no strife if you would become my wife. That's all I remember about that. It is funny. This is a picture not of the day that we were there, but an example of what we experienced in this wilderness moment. This moment of being alone and vulnerable, this moment of fear, of altitude sickness and illness, and yet we found love. I share this with you, and I'll go off that one, back to that one. Jesus too experienced times of wilderness experiences. In Matthew and Mark and Luke, our Bible tells of these times. They tell us that Jesus was drove there, and at that time he was tempted. He had a real tough go. He was hungry and thirsty, and he had to be cared for, they say, by angels. It wasn't a trip to a beautiful mountain retreat or to a place place on a lake or up to a mountain guest house. It was desolate.